One aspect of Warhol's life and career that our other materials don't really cover is the importance and influence of his studio space, which of course he called the Factory. The Factory became a legendary place in New York City throughout the 1960s and 70s. Of course, primarily it was the studio where he made his artwork. Or as some might say, he produced his artwork. Because at the height of his career, Warhol rarely participated in the actual process of making his large-scale prints. He hired a staff to do that. Here he is examining, or maybe you could say, doing something like quality control, like a good manager would, one of his artworks in process. Oftentimes, a series of identical, mechanically made prints would be presented to Warhol so that he could splash some paint or scribble some lines uniquely on each one, therefore increasing the value of them as original Andy Warhols. Warhol also became very interested in film and photography, and so his factory doubled as a photo studio. But the real thing about the factory was it was a modern-day salon. It was the world center of art and culture. And because of that, everyone in the arts and entertainment industries visited the factory whenever they were in New York. Everyone from teenage art school hipsters to some of the most famous artists in the world. In fact, the guy sitting at the far right there, that's a picture of none other than Marcel Duchamp, the guy who kind of started this all. Also note that the kid who's taking these pictures was named Stephen Shore. He took many of the photographs we've seen here. As one of the teenage kids who started hanging out there, Warhol took a liking to him and dubbed him the official documentary photographer of the factory. Remember Shore, we're going to talk about him later. The factory was also known for its crazy parties. Warhol loved having these people all around him all the time, and he essentially kept the doors open to anyone who wanted to visit and hang out. And of course, everyone wanted to hang out with Andy Warhol. At the time, he might not have been the biggest household celebrity kind of household name in the world, but to the biggest celebrity household names, Andy Warhol was the biggest celebrity. And of course, soon he aspired to be more than just a painter. He became our first celebrity mogul. Warhol was really the prototype for the entrepreneurial artists we have today. Everyone from Beyonce to the Kardashians to Kanye West owe Warhol a debt of gratitude. He did it first, and many would say he did it better because he invented it from whole cloth. In fact, early in the war, and you could see here that he moved into all sorts of different kinds of things. He co-founded Interview Magazine, was on television, did a lot of graphic arts. Rolling Stone's famous album cover was actually an Andy Warhol creation. Many people aren't aware of that. Did short films and things like that. And of course, he was really interested in music, and eventually he decided that the factory needed a house band for these parties, and he wanted to become a manager and a music producer. And sure enough, there's this kid from Long Island hanging out at the factory. His name is Lou Reed, and he drops out of college and is making a meager living writing songs for third-rate record companies. And again, he's another one of these young artists that Warhol takes a liking to. And so Warhol appoints Reed the leader of his new factory band, a band that would later become known as the Velvet Underground. And the band enjoyed a lot of critical success, in part because the critics, of course, were so smitten with Andy Warhol, and also a little bit of commercial success. In fact, by the time I got to art school in the mid-1980s, it was required listening that you listen to Velvet Underground in your little student art studio space. It's really hard to downplay the influence Andy Warhol has on the direction of pop music at the time. As we've seen, the factory becomes a meeting place for artists and musicians from all walks of life. In fact, here we see Lou Reed hanging out with Iggy Pop and David Bowie, who's visiting from England. Of course, Bowie's, of course, one of the biggest rock stars of the day in the early 1970s. And the influence of these three musicians hanging out in New York and at the factory is pretty impressive. If you're not familiar with Iggy Pop, his first band, the Stooges, was cited as a proto-punk band and was really one of the foundational influences of a little band from England we now know as the Sex Pistols, who, of course, put punk rock on the map, and on the English map. And, of course, eventually it migrates back over the Atlantic and influences bands like Husker Du and Black Flag, which is, of course, Henry Rollins' band. Meanwhile, that other aspect of these artists, the androgynous personas in the wild stage shows of Iggy Pop and David Bowie at the time. They influence another vein of popular music. In fact, there's a band in New York known as the New York Dolls, who they weren't around for too long, but their whole thing with the makeup and the costumes would influence another up and coming New York band, and that band stuck around a little bit longer, of course. It was when Kiss formed in 1974. They were often criticized for stealing ideas from Iggy Pop and David Bowie and the New York Dolls. But regardless, they took these ideas, of course, and turned them up to 11 and really created a whole new genre of music and spectacle in rock and roll. Something we know both nowadays as glam rock or hair metal. So we get Motley Crue, we get Guns N' Roses, and even today, there are bands that practice in this space, and it has a surprising appeal, you know. And look, I know we've traveled a long way from Andy Warhol's factory to get to the Struts, but I'm not sure the Struts even understand the influence that Warhol has on their own careers. But what was happening in the factories in the late 60s and early 70s really did incubate a massive amount of our creative production today in visual arts and music and film and photography and stuff like that. In fact, speaking of photography, let's bring back Stephen Shore, because of course he parlays Warhol's favor into a successful career. Stephen Shore becomes actually one of the most important photographers of his generation in the 1970s. He's also regarded as one of the pioneers of color photography as a fine art practice. Before this time, only black and white photography was really considered sort of valid fine art, and even then just barely. Color photography was relegated to a more lowbrow practice. It was amateur photography, it was advertising and things like that. It wasn't fancy high art. But Shore, along with photographers William Eggleston and Joel Meyerowitz, was really among one of the first to use color images that were finally regarded to be fine art, and almost assuredly with a little bit of a nudge from Andy Warhol and his reputation. He reinvigorates the practice. There's the word I'm looking for, reinvigorates. The practice of American landscape photography in the 1970s too. And this is a quiet but super important moment in the history of American art photography. By the 1970s, those great landscape photographers like Ansel Adams from the past, they were more associated with greeting cards and calendars than museums and galleries. And that's probably due to the fact that their images were pristine and sort of impossibly beautiful landscapes. They seemed sort of from another, they were anachronisms, right? They were from another time. Photographers like Shore recognized that that landscape really no longer existed, and they set out to create another great body of American photographs, this time featuring a very modern, very crowded, very dirty and polluted, but still a fundamentally American landscape. It was a critical landscape, and it's really a practice in photography that endures to this very day. But of course, the most famous artist who Warhol influenced and then promoted was Jean-Michel Basquiat. The story goes like this. Basquiat was a homeless, drug-addicted teenager of Haitian descent whom Warhol discovered painting graffiti out in the streets. Warhol immediately recognized him as a talent and a charismatic individual, and so he invites him to the factory where he provides Basquiat some support materials and funds to make paintings. What he also does, though, is he takes those paintings to his own gallery dealers and insists they represent Basquiat as well. Of course, Basquiat becomes instantly famous and wealthy. And sadly, that kills him because he overdoses on heroin at the age of 27. Tragically, the immense pressure of the gobs of money that fell upon Basquiat was more than a homeless kid with a drug problem could really handle. His work and work of others like him and whom he influenced has come to be known as Neo-Expressionism, to suggest a new generation of artists using contemporary modes of image making, especially graffiti art, towards the same aims as we've seen with the abstract expressionists. And of course, today Basquiat's paintings oftentimes sell for as much as $100 million. In fact, he now holds the record for the most expensive artwork made after 1980, a record that he actually wrestles from Andy Warhol. Like Basquiat, the factory also has a tragic demise. famously known to be open and inviting to all unusual and creative people. In 1968, it also becomes the site of the attempted murder of Andy Warhol. They made a movie about Valerie Solanas, who became upset with Warhol when he neglected to read a screenplay she had written, and he may have misplaced it even. Salinas, who was later found to be mentally ill, was furious and shot at Warhol 3 times at close range, hitting him once or twice. So reports vary on how many bullets actually hit him. Some say she was motivated by pure rage, and the other more interesting theory suggests that it was a weird combination of a terrorist act and a publicity stunt. In either case, the result was a 6-hour emergency surgery where it was rumored that Warhol died and was resuscitated several times on the table. And of course, he would suffer physically and emotionally for the rest of his life, and he had to wear a surgical corset to keep his organs in place for the rest of his life. While the factory continued to operate for the rest of Warhol's life, it really was no longer open and welcoming. It was no longer the refuge for artists and misfits that made it legendary.